What is going on, everybody? Happy Halloween and welcome to yet another 31 on 31. This time titled Pain and Suffering. And there are many different meanings to that subtitle of this year's 31 on 31 ranking. If you're just finding me for the first time or recently don't know what a 31 on 31 is, ever since Halloween of 2018, me and a group of friends every single October 31st get together under a theme and pick movie franchises that add up to 31, and we rank them from worst to best. We've done slashers, many different slasher franchises. We've done sci-fi horror. We have done action films. We've even done fantasy and a few other offshoots. But Halloween, typically we stick with horror. And this year, partially because I wanted to have some fun messing with the guys and see what comedy gold we could mine out of this concept, and partially because back in, I think, 2021, I reviewed most of these franchises. So if I'm going to do the work, we're damn sure going to pay off on it. We are doing Hellraiser, Saw, Hostel, and Wrong Turn. And the group of people participating in this year, I have links to all of their channels down in the video description below so that you can check out their rankings and see how they differ, both in the jokes or the bits or the editing style that they take on, as well as, of course, their ranking of these movies, which I am morbidly curious to see how different we actually are on this one. You've got my buddy Brian Lomax from Across the Sea. You've got Sean Chandler from Sean Chandler Talks About. You've got CP over at Willis Greedia. And joining us for the first time is Rudy from Gen X Reviews and Rude Advice. And to all of my compadres in Autop Stream and Rudy, our newcomer, I'd say I apologize, but I've been having fun watching you guys squirm for the last number of months, just bitching incessantly about why the fuck are you making us watch these?
But you can't do this to me.
Here we go.
Will there be boobs?
I think after this, I've more than paid back Brian for the Critters edition to our creature feature episode from a few years back. I think we're even now, Brian. You could stop. We could stop with the payback, and I'm going to be the one being paid back at this point because Brian's going to be just knocking down me and CP's door trying to get Paul Thomas Anderson or some shit into a 31 on 31.
What? Who the hell's talking to you?
Yeah, who the fuck's talking to you?
Anyway, guys, strap in. Get yourself something to enjoy to balance out the pain and suffering that we're about to endure together. Because kicking off this year's 31 on 31, the worst of this bunch of absolute dog shit is going to be Wrong Turn 5, Bloodlines. And, you know, even though there was a massive amount of movies in this 31 where it's like, God, could any of these just be tied for 31? This one I've known for a long time was definitely going to be my worst. I absolutely despise this movie. Wrong Turn in and of itself is my least favorite franchise of the bunch that we are doing this year. And up until I recently started looking at the Children of the Corn movies, I said for a while that was the worst franchise that I had ever covered on the 7 years that I've been doing this channel. And as bad as some of the Wrong Turn movies are, and quite a few of them are towards the bottom of my list, Wrong Turn 5 has everything that is bad about the worst Wrong Turn movies while being one of the most miserably bleak and mean-spirited movies I have ever seen in my life. So you have this bullshit Mountain Man festival, which really makes no sense as a festival in the middle of this ridiculous town. The production value on this town is laughable. They built a corner of a city block, and you just see the characters continuously just circle around them like Alice in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, like a fucking time loop. And then you have Three Finger and Sawtooth and One Eye that descend upon them that look like mountain men, and they start killing off these 20-somethings. But this one, you have Doug Bradley, Pinhead himself, as kind of the patriarch of this family. And most of the film, he's in prison, and they're essentially trying to break him out. And not only are the kills just drawn out for the sake of drawing out, like you have a guy buried up to his neck, and they take a lawnmower to him for reasons, but they get meaner as they go along, and it's not to the point where you can even enjoy how sick and depraved the movie is. It's to the point where you're like, I want to take a shower, and I've only seen 40 minutes of this fucking thing. You have one of the victims here that interacts with Doug Bradley while he's in the jail cell, and he more or less tells her, like, I'm going to physically abuse you, and I'm going to abuse you in other ways. Read into that how you will. And by the end of the movie, the note that the thing ends on is letting you as the audience know everything that he told this girl, who has her eyes gouged out at this point, is going to come true once the credits roll. That is the fate of the only surviving character, is everything that Doug Bradley told her was going to happen. It's just a gross fucking movie. So as bad as some of the movies here are on production value, on acting, on makeup effects, on story, this one is just god awful to get through, and I hate it. Coming in just above that at number 30 is going to be Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort. And, I would say that this is in pretty close competition with 5, but it's really no competition. That's how much I despise the last entry. This one is basically a softcore porn version of Wrong Turn, which, I'm sure Rudy got very excited about by the time he got past 5 and then clicked play on this one.
Oh, yes!
So essentially you have these 20-something characters again. This guy is told that he has like an inheritance and he's drawn to this property, and the people there are claiming to be his long-lost family members, and they're trying to like indoctrinate him into this clan basically, only they're all inbreeding. They're all fucking each other. And, the main chick is hot, but that's like his cousin, and it's weird and it's gross. And then all the while, between all of that weird like fetish porn shit, you have the cheapest version of left hand, or what the fuck, left finger, 3 finger, the wrong turn hillbilly bitches. You got the cheapest version of them just kind of sprinkled throughout, doing shit, killing people in random ways. They kill a guy by shoving a hose in his asshole. Need I say more? Do you need more justification? 30. Number 29 is going to be controversial, I can tell you that right now, and it's going to be Hellraiser Inferno. Now, I will say this, production value-wise, direction-wise, the visuals especially, this is far from deserving of being this low on this list, but I just really do not enjoy watching this movie because of the main character and because of the story it takes you on. This is directed by Scott Derrickson, who I really enjoy a good bit of his work, especially his very recent work. And it's one of the better concepts of the movie that's not a Hellraiser movie that's really trying to be a Hellraiser movie, which is about half this fucking franchise. Essentially, you're following this detective character who is a complete shithead. And it's very obvious, at least it was to me from the beginning, that this is essentially purgatory. He's going through and just seeing all these weird, gnarly Silent Hill type visuals. And it's eventually revealed that, yeah, this is purgatory. He is in hell, and we've just kind of been watching his judgment the entire time. There's another twist regarding Pinhead's identity, where James Remar has been like his psychologist the entire movie, and then he has this horrible CGI transition into Pinhead. And that's the only Pinhead you get in this fucking movie, is that horribly executed twist. And so while this movie is impressive in the visual department, and Scott Derrickson, even from early on, shows that he's a very capable director, and history has shown that he has risen to that occasion, this movie is just not fun to watch for me because I despise the lead character and all of the elements of this guy's mind and psyche that we are forced to experience.
It's like we stepped inside the mind of an asshole.
At 28, coming in just above that by a razor's edge, we have Hellraiser Hellseeker. And honestly, the only thing that saves this from being my least favorite Hellraiser film is that we get a little bit more of Kirsty Cotton. And despite the fact that I think that the movie should have utilized her significantly more than it actually did, and it used her sparingly to use her as a plot twist, which is just dumb, what we actually get as far as the expansion of her character, I really like here. You're following the guy from like the Allstate commercials, the fucking mayhem dude. And the whole movie is basically just him going through life, trying to figure out what happened to his wife, who is Kirsty Cotton. And every time he turns a fucking corner, some chick wants to jump his dick.
She touched my peppy, Steve.
By the way, how many movies on this list, how many of the 31 seem like a softcore porn script that was just slightly molded into a horror sequel? Somebody add it up. I want that statistic. Nonetheless, just like with Hellraiser Inferno, by the end of it, and it's incredibly obvious, you realize this guy's in purgatory the whole time, and he's being judged, and we're just seeing visuals of his guilt and his conscience and him trying to figure shit out about why he's in hell. And then the ultimate reveal, which is the only piece of the movie I genuinely like, is that his wife, Kirsty Cotton, who he fucked everything but her, which, have you seen Ashley Lawrence? Have you seen Murder of Crows? She don't take too kindly to that shit. And there's also some inklings that he was trying to get rid of her. And so she decides to get rid of his ass first. And he sets a trap for her to go and get taken by Pinhead. And she's clearly the one that got away. And she's like, "What's up, motherfucker? Remember me? Got a deal for you. 5 souls in exchange for this one. What you think? And so, yeah, another generic script that doesn't feel like it's a Hellraiser movie except for the last 5 minutes, but I at least appreciate whatever amount of Kirsty Cotton we've got. Coming in at 27 is going to be Wrong Turn 3, Dead End, Left 4 Dead. What the fuck? Left 4 Dead. Does it matter? I'll be honest with you, I don't remember a whole lot about this movie aside from the barbed wire cocoon kill, which I genuinely think is the best kill in this franchise, and that's probably the reason why it's a slightly above part 5 and 6, but this is right there when this franchise just turned into an absolute direct-to-DVD just slog to get through, where you have, I think, only one of the hillbilly family in this one in Three Finger. You have a bunch of prisoners that their bus breaks down, and so you got prison guards and prisoners out in the woods getting picked off one by Three Finger, and there's an interesting dynamic with having some prisoners work with their guards, and they kind of realize they have more in common than they realize. Things like that we've seen 100 times before and done significantly better, but it's okay. It's a watchable Wrong Turn direct-to-video sequel, but how many fucking awesome things did you pass on before you decided that a direct-to-video Wrong Turn sequel was what you're going to spend your time on? 26 is Hellraiser Revelations, and this is most popular for answer of worst of the franchise, and people are passionately in agreement with that more times than not. And I understand why, because from a production value and budget standpoint, this thing is absolute ass. It is almost embarrassing how terrible a lot of the things look in this film, especially Pinhead himself. What the fuck was that?
Who did this to us?
It's incredibly cheap. It's incredibly cheap. But the redeeming factor of this film, and why I don't have it at dead last, is because this, outside of the first 2 films, and this was before the remake, obviously, is the most Hellraiser feeling sequel since the second film. Like, all of the themes and the storylines that they go through regarding these 2 friends, and one of them, getting the lament configuration and trying to kill his way back, similar to Frank. Narratively, this movie feels the most appropriate as a Hellraiser sequel in like 2 decades. And so I appreciate quite a bit about that. I think that some of the directions it takes in the last act and trying to have some plot twists and everything, it feels like there was some effort here. Now, notoriously, this movie was only made so that they could hang on to the rights, so they just kind of rushed out and shit out a sequel really quick for those reasons, which that always is going to paint a movie's legacy in an extreme negative way for those that is knowledgeable about that. But even with that being known, I still appreciate that this is not the 7th movie of random detective guy trying to be like Seven Light, and then Pinhead shows up for 5 seconds. And speaking of all that, coming in at number 25 is going to be Hellraiser Deader. And this is certainly one of the most egregious movies in this franchise of just having no business calling itself Hellraiser. I at least like the main character a bit more. And so while I would say there's a bit more visual flair to Inferno, and there's a much better payoff in Hellseeker, I can get through the 90 minutes of this one a bit easier because I'm spending more time with a character that I don't absolutely despise. Now, by the end of it, the way that they work Pinhead into the angle is insulting and it's ridiculous. And it just, by this point, you're like, dude, just stop making these fucking movies. You have no idea what anybody wants from a Hellraiser film. Clearly, you have this plot going on where there's this cult where they're killing people and then reviving them with some kind of a voodoo ritual. And this investigator, this like reporter or something, I forget exactly what she is trying to figure out what exactly is going on. And of course, the lament configuration and Pinhead and the Cenobites are involved to some degree that makes no sense just for the fact of getting Doug Bradley on screen for 5 minutes by the third act. So it's forgettable. It's not a movie I'd ever watch again, but at least I'm not like wanting to reach to the TV and strangle the main character for 90 minutes. So we're moving up. Things are looking up. Number 24 is Wrong Turn 2 Dead End. And, I used to put this one below part 3, but upon rewatch, aside from the fact that this one goes to an uncomfortable level with exploring the incest side of Wrong Turn, much more than all the movies except for maybe 6, there's a bit more entertainment value here, I think, than number 3. There's a bit more fun to be had with the gore because 3 starts to implement a lot of CGI, and this one at least stays mostly practical. There's some pretty disgusting kills and some disgusting injuries. And Henry Rollins is a lot of fun, especially by the third act, going like full Rambo. So while, again, this is not a movie that I care for very much, I appreciated some of the entertainment value it had a little bit more upon rewatch. Again, it's still a wrong turn direct-to-video sequel. Number 23, Hellraiser Judgment, a movie that holds the crown as the only film that I have ever reviewed on this channel that I nearly vomited while describing the plot.
These women are like spitting together into this cup and then pouring it into his mouth while he's got it pried open.
This movie is fucking disgusting. That's the main thing I always remember about it. Now, production value-wise, it's a step up from Hellraiser Revelations. There is at least an attempt to bring some new lore into the franchise with the Arbiter and some of the different things going on that is kind of adjacent to the Pinhead Cenobite dimension and how somebody is judged. And there was creativity here. It's disgusting in the way that it's executed, but there is at least some creativity, some gnarly visuals, and I can appreciate that. It's also the movie that finally brings angels into the fold. And how many movies did that fucking take before you have demons and Cenobites and all that, and then they acknowledge the other side of things? But beyond that, it's another one of those Hellraiser movies where it literally seems like there was somebody that watched Seven and did like a bullshit weekend write of a ripoff script, and it collected dust on some producer's desk for 8 months, and then he found it underneath a bunch of Post-its and said, "What is this?" Blew the dust off of it, wrote Pinhead on like 4 pages, and then turned it in, and we got another Hellraiser sequel. You got a guy that's investigating murders that is just eerily similar to Seven. And by the end of it, shocker, he's a shitbag. He's the murderer. He's the person who is being judged. And angels come down and Pinhead. Who gives a fuck? 22, Wrong Turn for Bloody Beginnings. And, for somebody that doesn't like prequels almost ever when it comes to horror franchises, this is barely a prequel. Like, honestly, aside from the scene at the beginning where they show the 3 hillbillies as kids and try to give you some explanation for why they have the 3 monikers that they do, after that, you could just call this a sequel. I mean, you have the hillbilly family taking on a bunch of 20-somethings in an asylum. It's the same shit. But what I liked about this one a bit more was that there's some pretty good kills here. There's one where a dude gets his limbs torn off. That's pretty gnarly. Again, a little bit more practical work here than the third one, so I always appreciate that. And then I also thought that the asylum setting was creepy. I've said it numerous times. Hospitals, things like that, they give me very creepy vibes. So whenever you put them in a horror film, that definitely is an effective atmosphere to put your film in to get a reaction out of me. And this is the next movie on the list to throw into that porn bin because, God, like the first 30 minutes of this, there is so much random sex shit. I mean, they've got lesbian scenes and group sex, and it's just like, Jesus Christ, like, did I click on the wrong movie? My wife walked in when I watched this when I was trying to review it for the first time, and I'm like, I swear to God, somebody's going to die soon. Just hold on. Number 21, Saw 3D. We have finally made it to the Saw franchise, 21 films in. Oh, there's some shit in this list. Saw 3D, look, it's the worst of this franchise. Pretty close tied with the next movie that I'm going to talk about from Saw, but there's at least some entertainment value to be had here. There is an interesting game going on regarding Sean Patrick Flannery's character where he is a fake victim and they're, paying him back for that. I like that. I think that there is some pretty good kills here. This has the most kills of the franchise. So while it has some really good ones, it also has a lot of shitty ones. Quantity, not quality in this movie. And, there's a couple of interesting things that happen as far as wrapping up the story, at least the first time that they tried to end this franchise. Beyond all of that, you have Hoffman as the main character, yet again, outside of the game. Not a fan of that character. You have this attempted plot twist regarding Carrie Elway's character that to me is just blatantly obvious. As soon as you see him on screen, you're like, okay, I see where this is going. There is a lot of issues that came about with them shooting this in 3D, namely the color of the blood. It's fluorescent pink when you watch the Blu-ray, the DVD, whatever you're watching it at home. I don't know why they roped themselves into that. Something to do with the visual on the camera. It looked more red with the fluorescent pink in the 3D effect, but then you fuck the way that everybody's going to see this movie forever and always past the opening weekend. So it's a really weird effect for the gore here, and it takes you out of the kills quite a bit, which is not a thing you want to have said about your Saw film. And was a few 3D shots and a gimmick in the marketing really worth tainting the legacy of this movie forever and always? I mean, does having something move closer towards you in the screen really hide how shitty it is? I mean, look, You feel any better about this? I don't. Coming in at number 20 is going to be Saw 5. And to me, this is the most boring of the Saw films, which is a kiss of death more times than not when you're trying to have a horror film is boring you. I do like some of the aspects going on with the actual game and what they're trying to teach these people as far as you need to work together, and they just absolutely epic fail that lesson and start murdering each other one by one, and they pay for it by the end. The actual traps are interesting enough, but you know, the problem with the film is that this is the first movie where Hoffman is the lead character, and without sounding like a broken record, don't care for that character at all. So me following his journey, as well as Luke from Gilmore Girls and his journey to take him down, I just don't give a shit. And this is the one movie that is most egregious with having the main plot line and the trap, the game plot line just be so separate from each other that it feels like two movies going on at once, and they just don't have anything that are crossing over to make them feel like they make sense next to each other. Then you get to the end with the twist reveal of Luke from Gilmore Girls' plot and how Hoffman outsmarted him. If you don't like the character, I'm not going to be happy about the fact that he wins, and I just feel like it's kind of a lame ending. It's one of the worst endings of this franchise to me. It just has no impact, so it's okay. It's watchable, but it's boring. 19 is going to be Hellraiser Hellworld, another movie that I'm a lot softer on with the Hellraiser franchise than most fans of the franchise. This is also one that tends to be very low on most people's rankings, and I understand why. This, in competition with Hellraiser Deader, is the most egregious of just not having any business to call itself a Hellraiser movie whatsoever. This is a generic early 2000s slasher film that they just splice Pinhead in a couple of visuals. And even by the end of it, the whole twist and everything being revealed is that it has nothing to do with Pinhead. It's all just something going on in people's heads. So it is the most artificial of any of the Hellraiser movies. But as somebody that was in his teenage years in the early 2000s, I still get a kick out of the early 2000s horror approach. And so I can watch this movie and have a good time with it, where you have all these immature ass 20-somethings that go off to this party that's hosted by Lance Henriksen. There's another point of how awesome this movie is. Lance Henriksen, I mean, that's one star right there. And one of the 20-somethings, Superman himself, Henry Cavill, and he gets a blowjob in this. Bit of an unsubtle omen to how he's going to get fucked in his career after this movie. So yeah, it's not a movie I love. It's not a movie that I would even die on a hill for. But if you would ask me what post-Hellraiser 4 sequels would you have the least amount of struggle to rewatch, this is one of them. Number 18 is going to be Saw 4. And if Saw 5 is the most boring film in the Saw franchise, Saw 4 is the most forgettable movie in the franchise. Because as many times as I've seen it, of which it's like 4 times at this point, I have to look back up clips and Wikipedia plot synopsis or watch my old review to remember what the fuck happens in this thing. And then within minutes, I'm like, oh yeah, this is the one where the guy gets tested and killed for doing his job. This was the point that I initially fell off the Saw franchise back when these movies were being released. I was a big fan of the first 3. After Jigsaw died, I was like, okay, well, that's clearly done, right? Like, there's nowhere else to go. Oh, there's a 4th one coming out? Why? And this movie suffers significantly with the absence of Jigsaw, with the absence of Tobin Bell. And we didn't quite get the rise of Hoffman yet. That's the twist by the end of the film, so that at least has a little bit of it going for it. But the guy that you're following is like a C-level character from Saw 2 and 3, and the game doesn't make any sense to me. It's absolutely ridiculous why he's being tested to this degree and why he is put in a situation to lose his life. It's the most egregious to me of the games that just are undeserved. And then aside from a couple of pretty gnarly kills, which you could take to the bank, just about every one of these Saw movies is going to have 1 or 2 of those. By the end of it, the ultimate reveal of we have yet another apprentice was ridiculous in Saw 4. And they used that twist another 2 or 3 times later on in the franchise. So yeah, Jigsaw, that dude needs to be just like a salesman. Maybe that's how he made all his money, that he can build all this shit, because he can talk any motherfucker into being his apprentice. Number 17, Hellraiser Bloodline. Only one of 2 Hellraiser films that I have seen on the big screen, and the other one is actually the remake, of which I'm only part of a small collection of people that were able to see that at Fantastic Fest. So my dad took me to see this whenever I was a kid. I had never seen a Hellraiser movie before that, and it was years until I watched another Hellraiser film. needless to say, me watching this didn't really encourage me to check out the others. This movie does have some things going for it. I do like the fact that they give 3 very distinct time periods here. You have one like back in the 1700s or 1600s, and you have one that was like present day at the time, and then one in the future in space. And of all of the in space horror sequels, this is one of the less offensive ones because they at least make narrative sense of why we are in space, and it's not like offensive to the Pinhead character. They actually do some interesting things with the creature designs being in space and in the future. I really like the first act of this movie, the period piece side of things. I would have actually preferred to see a whole movie just in that time period, and I think that there's some pretty creepy visuals here with the people with the old white wigs and stuff. There's just something really eerie about that. You have a chick that's brought in who's kind of like the new secondary villain character here. This is still when we got a decent amount of Pinhead. He wasn't just a guest star. And there's some gnarly stuff. There's some dudes getting their heads smashed together to become a Cenobite. There's like some dogs and shit. I mean, it's an interesting enough Hellraiser film. It's not completely successful. I do think that each act is less interesting than the one that preceded it, but it's very watchable. Coming in at number 16 is The Hangover Part 4, also known as Hostel Part 3. I had never seen this movie before a week ago. This was the only movie that I had to watch for the first time for this ranking, and I was expecting this to be like bottom 5 level because just seeing a direct-to-video Hostel movie that had no involvement of Eli Roth, like, you couldn't have said much more to convince me this was going to suck absolute ass. And color me shocked when I watched it, and I was like, you know what? For a direct-to-video horror sequel, that's pretty damn good. On its surface, it's the same setup. You get a bunch of douchebags that go to Vegas to have a good time and to fuck and drink and do drugs and party and do some debauchery.
And we're the 3 best friends that anybody could have. We're the 3 best friends that anyone could have.
And they get one by one sucked into this human trafficking and torture scenario where one by one they pulled off and they're getting tortured and killed in front of a group of people that paid to see it, and inevitably you're going to have one of them by the end that rises and tries to escape from all of it, and hopefully they do. But there's a lot of things that they do to that initial setup to make it distinctly different than the first 2 films. First of all is just on its surface, the Vegas setting, putting it in America, is a very different vibe to this, which I appreciated. Maybe not as icky as the setting in the first 2 films. That doesn't really prey on that fear of being out of your element like the first 2, but I do think it brings in a unique visual and a unique pace to the movie that I liked. Also, there's a number of times throughout this movie where they set up something that seems very run-of-the-mill like the first 2 films scenarios, and you're like, okay, I see where this is going, and then they pull a bit of a plot twist. They do a bit of a reveal to subvert your expectations, and I think that most of them were pretty effective. They try to do it a bit too much, so you start to get a little bit privy to what is going on, and you kind of see the magic trick coming. But most of the twists that they implement here, I think, were actually pretty successful. A lot of the characters, they're direct-to-video actors, so you can only expect so much. But again, for that benchmark, they're actually pretty good. You've got Sunshine from Remember the Titans, who's good here. You got Matt McNamara from Nip Tuck, who's good here. I kind of wish the movie didn't devolve into kind of a typical action thriller in the last third of it. I don't think that fits in the Hostel franchise. I think that kills a lot of the tension and a lot of the horror side of things and turns it more into just like a revenge thriller. But beyond that, this movie was much better than I thought it was going to be. It's much better than a lot of people gave it credit for. And even though it's a direct-to-video Hostel sequel, it's better than a number of theatrically released sequels from these other franchises. Coming over the hump, we're halfway there. Number 15, Saw 6. This is a Saw sequel that I think is good. I've never quite understood the massive amount of fandom that this one has. This is one that a lot of people have in like their top 2 or 3. I've seen a number of people that have it as their number 1 of the franchise, which it's interesting. I like having those conversations and difference of opinion, but I don't really see much about this movie that's a whole lot better than the ones that I've listed below it. There is a bit of an angle here that a lot of people can identify with and get behind, where you have the insurance, the medical insurance industry that's kind of being tested here, and you have a character that's the focal point of that, and a lot of people can kind of invest themselves and be like, yeah, punish him, teach him. I don't quite belong to that camp. I'm not somebody who can completely enjoy the misery this guy gets put through and have that be the justification, but nonetheless, it's interesting. It's different. I think that there's a number of traps here that are pretty good. The shotgun carousel is one of the more memorable ones of the franchise. I do think that of the Hoffman movies, this is the most enjoyable section of his story because he's kind of on the run and he is just in straight up murder mode. And I have a little bit more fun with a movie that just completely lets him off the leash and lets him go psycho versus one that's trying to have him actually be a legit apprentice, which all of us, including Jigsaw, know there ain't no fucking way that guy's worthy of being an apprentice. So I like this movie. I have a decent enough time with it. I just don't quite get the hype. Number 14 is going to be Jigsaw, and much how I don't quite get the hype with Saw 6, I don't quite get the hate for Jigsaw. Now, there are certain elements to it that I understand eliciting some bad reactions from fans. I was certainly one of them, where you have a number of years after Saw 3D where you think Saw is done, then they start ramping up and hyping you up for this movie Jigsaw. In the posters and the advertisement, they're teasing that somehow Jigsaw is going to be back. And before we had Saw X, I was thinking, okay, is this going to be like other place on the timeline? We're going to go back and actually be where Jigsaw is alive again and kick off from there. That sounds like that could be a good idea. What do they got in store for us? And what they got in store for us is a big collection of the same shit we've already seen. You got some decent traps in this movie. None of them are really that memorable. None of them would make a tier of like the best or the most memorable of the franchise. By the way, shameless plug, I ranked every single trap in this franchise. It's a massive video. It took a long time. Please watch it. And the ultimate reveals in the third act was annoying how derivative they were. First of all, they do the whole time displacement thing from 2 to where you realize you're actually watching a game from 10 years prior when John Kramer was like prototype Jigsaw, and that's how they squeeze just a little bit, like 5 minutes of screen time out of Tobin Bell, which just kind of twists the knife of the fact that he is the big glaring hole in most of these movies after they killed him. And then they follow that up with even more egregious, which is another apprentice, and the least interesting reveal of an apprentice of the entire franchise. But it's watchable. It's a solidly directed Saw movie. It's got a good pace to it. The characters are fine to follow. Like, none of them I hate like in some of the other movies. So it's somewhere in the middle of my Saw ranking because it's one of the more watchable of this collection of movies. I get why some people just really hold this thing to the fire for being like a failed reboot attempt, but I don't think the mistakes that this movie makes make it the worst of the franchise by any stretch. Number 13, Hellraiser 2 Hellbound. And this is another film that I see quite a few people, almost an equal amount of the people that put the first film as the best of the franchise. There's that same amount of people I've seen that have this as their favorite Hellraiser film. And it's very different from the first film while being a very appropriate companion piece to that first story. What I like about this one is, again, because it carries on the vibe of the first film pretty successfully. I like the fact that we get more Kirsty Cotton. I like the fact that Julia comes back and kind of trades with Frank to be the main antagonist here. I think there's a lot of interesting visuals and creativity as far as expanding the lore and expanding the hell dimension, the Cenobite dimension, and introducing the Leviathan and all of that. There's a lot of creativity in this movie. And with those first 2 Hellraiser films, you would be hard-pressed as a horror fan to not have a lot of faith in the future of this franchise. And I also like how Kirsty Cotton's character has to kind of evolve to be the protector in this one, to the point where she actually wears Julia's skin. That shit was pretty fucking cool. Where this one is nowhere near the top of my favorite Hellraiser films, though, is that this movie's fucking weird. Where the first one is just a lot of pain and torture and depravity and masochism and sadism. This one certainly has elements of that, but it's much more about interdimensions and like it's a lot more fantastical here. Even the doctor who eventually becomes the Leviathan, a lot of weird facial expressions from him that they just decide to linger on while he's like got his tentacle dicks coming out and he's just like the fact that he goes into a room and just lays waste to all of the Cenobites, including Pinhead, in seconds, unforgivable to me. And it just strays a bit too far from the tone and the feel of what I want in a Hellraiser film, of which we only get maybe 3 times in this franchise, so maybe that's not what the actual feel and the vibe of a Hellraiser film is at all. Maybe we're all crazy. Maybe this detective story shit where Pinhead comes in the last 5 minutes, maybe that's the true template of Hellraiser, and we just refuse to accept it. So I'm fine to rewatch this one if I'm binging it. If I watch the first film, I will absolutely put on this one next, but it's not one that I'm just going to yank off the shelves and watch by itself. Number 12 is Saw 3. And, this is a movie that I liked quite a bit when it first came out. I thought the first 3 Saw films were a nice little bunch of movies, that they had increasingly more disgusting traps. You had an interesting little bit of lore and a bit of a not so convoluted yet of a plot regarding Jigsaw's plans and who he was teaching certain lessons to. And, even back then, we only really had Amanda as an apprentice, and that was plausible enough for me. So this one carried on that very well. And I actually, while not liking the character too much of Jeff and how fucking slow he walks throughout every single room of this movie, I do like his actual game and how it kind of thematically coincides with what they're trying to teach him. And each individual trap gets all the more gross. The pig gut one was pretty nasty, but then you follow it up with the rack, which is my favorite trap in this entire franchise. And honestly, I think of all of them is probably the one that I would want to be in the least. I think that the whole twist regarding who is actually being tested by the third act was pretty well done. If this had been the last Saw film, I think that they did a pretty decent job of capping off the story of Jigsaw. Obviously, they had many more plans beyond that, namely to make fucking money. But as an individual movie, this is one of the Saw sequels that I wouldn't mind just throwing on without the necessity of watching the ones before and after it. I could just throw on Saw 3, check it out, have a decent enough time, wince a few times, and be good. Coming in at number 11 is Hostel Part 2. And, this is a movie that a few slight little changes to certain things, this would easily be my favorite Hostel film. And in a lot of ways, especially the third act, I do think it is possibly the best of the movies, and it's just the impact that the first one had on me that kind of keeps it out of that number 1 slot. I'll get into more of that whenever I get to Hostel. But Hostel Part 2 takes a lot of the setup of the first film and changes it up a bit to where instead of following a bunch of 20-something douchebags, we are now following a bunch of girls that are backpacking through Europe. And again, you're stuck with caricature characters. There's not really a whole lot of development with them, much like the first film. You got one character that's kind of quiet and stoic. You got one of them that's kind of loud and whorish. And then you got the other one that is sweet and innocent and very much naive. And they're put into this situation, and you get a lot more expansion on how the elite hunting group works, how these people are trafficked, how they are selected and bid on, and how the whole interworkings of this little secret society goes through. And I think that that's the most interesting part of the movie, especially when you get to view a lot of that through the eyes of 2 potential clients, one of which very loud chest beating, like alpha male type, and the other one a lot more quiet and nerdy and reserved and seemingly more innocent. And by the third act, they pull off some really cool stuff, some really good writing here to where you have the very unexpected twist of the personalities of those 2 clients very much being not what we expected, and one of them turning out to be a coward, the other one turned out to be a fucking psycho, and the twist of his performance from quiet reserve to violent psycho is actually really well done. I think the whole last 10 minutes of how the last surviving character is able to survive this situation is a really cool event to happen, especially in light of how things went in the first film. The only things that hold this one back to me is, first of all, you have the character from the first film being unceremoniously killed off in the first 5 minutes. I hate that. I know why they do it. I understand what they're trying to establish, and it's something that a lot of other horror films have done, but to me, it can very easily be cheap when horror sequels do that, and this was not only cheap, it was kind of offensive, because it's like, goddamn, the first movie is so fucking miserable as far as the situation and like the horror that you see these characters go through. Can we get a little fucking relief at knowing that one guy got away? And it's a lot harder, it's a lot more gut-wrenching, it's much more uncomfortable and unsettling to watch hostile events happen to women. It's just the way that it is. The first film is not easy to watch by any means, but when you put women in those situations, it's all the worse. And I know that was intentional. That was the whole point of the movie, and they succeeded with that. But when you have Heather Matarasso's character, who is hung upside down, butt-ass naked and then slowly just levitates over this big, gnarly-ass pool for somebody to do whatever they want with her. That is incredibly hard to watch. That is the most gut-wrenching minute or two of all three of these films. Number 10 is Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth, the dirty slasher Hellraiser film. This is the fun Hellraiser film, of which there's one. This is the only time. They had about as much fun with these Hellraiser movies as Brian's gonna have doing this video. This is a really cheesy movie. If you're not into 80s slashers and some of the schlock that can come along with that era, I can understand this being one of your least favorite Hellraiser films, but to me, I enjoy the fact that we get a bit of a break from all of the dark and depraved themes of these movies to a certain degree, and we have a little bit more fun with it. You get a lot more interesting and goofy Cenobite designs. I mean, you got a guy that shoots CDs out of his fucking mouth, for Christ's sake. And by the third act, it just becomes an army of Cenobites just taking people out in this club and taking people out on the streets, and it's a good time. You got fucking Lemmy singing over it. Hellraiser! This is the most metal of any of the Hellraiser films. It's going to be high on my list. It's just the way that it is. Oh, and bring that porn bin back, because we can throw this bitch in that collection. There's a whole sequence here where a dude just continuously brings chicks into this basement room and fucks them on a bed while Pinhead is encased in this little spinning tower, forced to watch the whole thing. He's like, "Oh, you have no idea the hell I can bring you. Sucker titty." Number 9, we find ourselves at the OG Wrong Turn. And, you know, this is an early 2000s horror flick, and it has a lot of charm and a lot of staying power and a lot of nostalgia for me for those reasons. This is one of 2 Wrong Turn films that I would give a positive review for, and that I would genuinely want to rewatch, and I have rewatched numerous times. You got a really good cast here. You got Eliza Dushku, you've got Desmond Harrington, who eventually went on to be Quinn in Dexter, you got Jeremy Sisto, you got Emmanuel Sharik, I believe is how you pronounce her name. Basically, the whole cast is recognizable to me. You even got Kevin Zegers and Lindy Booth in this. Disney Channel alumni in a Wrong Turn film. You got the kid from Air Bud who gets murdered directly after receiving a blowjob from the chick from Jet Jackson. And in this first film, while it is definitely a pretty blatant ripoff of a lot of Texas Chainsaw elements, it does pretty well with them. Like, it stands out enough. And if you are a fan of Texas Chainsaw, this is not something that would offend you. You're just like, okay, it's playing in that sandbox, but we'll see what you can do with it. I think a lot of the kills here are pretty good. The gore is pretty satisfying. You know, there's a lot of leaning into the cannibalism side of things. You know, we didn't quite touch on the incest stuff yet. That's for the next one and onward. But it's a tense little horror flick. You know, it's got a lot of good slasher elements to it, but you actually care about these characters. You want them to survive. And even though they do a couple of stupid things, for the most part, you're not really watching people descend into this situation because of stupid decision making. These people just know the woods and you cannot escape them. And every time they get this close to escaping, something happens to where Three Finger and Sawtooth and One Eye know better, and they close back in on them. And so it's a good little ride. If you like slasher flicks, if you like early 2000s horror, you can do a hell of a lot worse than Wrong Turn. Number 8 is going to be Spiral from the Book of Saw. This is another movie in the Saw franchise that certain fans are extremely down on, that I can understand certain elements of that, but anywhere near the bottom of your Saw ranking and you lose me. I really want to have those conversations. Like, please, explain to me how this is worse than Saw 3D. This was the second attempt to reboot this franchise after they closed it off with Saw 3D, and Jigsaw absolutely failed at doing that. And so you had early scripts and early ideas that eventually became Saw X, and then when Chris Rock came in as a fan of this franchise, met with some Lionsgate people at a wedding, I believe, and gave a few pitches of ideas that he would want to do to implement himself to try to expand his career into horror, do something a little bit different. Then this reboot movie became something different entirely, of which is a very classic Saw approach, and in the vein of being kind of Seven light and having a lot of those Seven vibes and Seven approaches to a killer teaching people lessons and detectives trying to figure out who the killer is, with the very unique angle of exploring police brutality and having everybody that is being taught lessons be a part of the police force, and their traps very much thematically matching whatever their biggest crimes of being a cop are. And that's what I really like about this. This one harkens back to a lot of those classic elements from the first couple of films that the series very much lost sight of after 3. And I also think that it's some of the most memorable, some of the most effective traps and kills of the entire franchise. It's shot and directed very well. I think that this one is as successful, if not maybe even a little more successful than the first one, of capturing those 7 angles without feeling too much like 7. I think Chris Rock does good whenever he is being Chris Rock. Whenever he's trying to be the hard-ass detective with a chip on his shoulder, I don't feel like his performance is very good. I just don't think Chris Rock has that kind of range, and those scenes are pretty bad to me. They stand out a lot. Captain, you gotta give me this case. Even scenes where he's walking, if he's trying to put on that tough guy look and he's just squinting his eyes like... But the biggest knock against this movie is that the ultimate reveal, the killer reveal, the twists and turns that it has in store for you in the third act, unbelievably predictable. Possibly the most predictable of the entire franchise. It's in competition with like maybe one other ending. You know, I still think that thematically it comes together well, but when you have a movie that is hinging its entire experience as an audience member on whether or not you're going to be surprised with its ultimate reveals, and they very much dropped the ball on that, that's a big-ass problem. If this movie had pulled off some really good twists and really shocked me and surprised me, and I just did not know what the third act had in store for me, this potentially could have been even higher in my Saw ranking. And there's only a few movies above this that are left that would have been very controversial to say this is better than those. But honestly, I like Spiral that much. It's just those couple of issues that I would not feel comfortable putting it any higher on the ranking. Number 7 is going to be the Wrong Turn reboot from a couple of years ago. And you know what? I really dig this movie. Now, it does have some issues. There is a bit of some weak storytelling regarding the main character and a few others in the first half of the movie, to where just simple lines of dialogue are given and just throwaway lines, and that's all the character development you get for them. That's people kind of just living out as caricatures for most of the movie. And I think the initial half of this film sets you up very intentionally to feel like this is going to be just another Wrong Turn movie. And the first time that you watch it, that's a negative side of your experience, because you're just like, this is the same old shit. It's just different a little bit. It looks a little cleaner. These characters are a little different. But then you get to a point in the film where everything that you have been shown up to this point is turned on its head. And everything that you are thinking, along with the main characters, about this community of people that they have unfortunately descended on in these mountains is turned on its head. And I think the movie is really smart with the way that it sets that up and pays it off. And there's also a really rewarding exploration there of people assuming things and assuming too much, especially negatively, about communities that they don't understand and communities that they are not a part of. You know, there's a scene where they walk into this kind of podunk southern town. One of the couples is gay, one of the couples is interracial. And without saying too much, you're just physically shown that they're a bit uncomfortable of like, okay, they're probably not going to like us because we're gay or because I'm a white girl with a black guy. And where the movie could very easily start to get preachy with that, that's as far as it goes. And it's paid off really well by the third act of the film with how this community that they judged actually ends up being. And even more so, when they're doing all of these things in response to the arrival of this mountainous community, all of that gets turned on its head in like this trial. And so the movie is really successful at exploring something and having a message without beating you over the fucking head with it, and also surprising you with the way that it's trying to tell its message. And I also think that the main character, who seemed about as flat as a damn board when it comes to storytelling and character development, actually ends up being a bit of a badass bitch by the last third of this film, especially in like the post-credits scene, which you absolutely should watch all the way to its end. And she ends up being a character that I remember this movie for quite a bit, and somebody that endures an absolutely horrific situation that is drawn out to an unbearable length and rises above by the end of it and becomes like this warrior because of what she has experienced. And that's pretty fucking cool. The only thing about this movie's narrative structure that I felt was a giant missed opportunity is you're shown these characters, these 20-somethings that are, you know, going off into the woods, typical Wrong Turn situation. They end up in this community and things go very badly. And then you switch perspectives to Matthew Modine, who is the father of the main character, as he is trying to search for his daughter. And for some reason, they decide to show very clearly to the audience the time difference between when the characters got taken by the mountain community and when Matthew Modine starts his search in the woods, when I feel like it would have been a brilliant plot twist among the other really well done plot twists to have him descend into this mountain community and find his daughter and her boyfriend, and then it's revealed to you that these fuckers have been there for like a year. So it's definitely got its issues. There's definitely small things that could have been done better. There's some major things that could have been done better. But for all of the horror remakes and reboots that we have gotten that just try to do the same old shit and just give us a modern version of everything that the older movies did much better and have much more staying power for, this is one that actually takes the vibe and the overall concept of Wrong Turn and then does something extremely different with it. And for me, it's all the more successful because of that. Even if it doesn't pay off, I would prefer a movie taking risks and doing something different as opposed to giving me exactly what I expected. Coming in at number 6 is going to be the Hellraiser remake, and this is another one that I didn't really know what to expect. I was lucky enough to check this out at Fantastic Fest last year, so I'm among a small group of people that actually saw this on the big screen, and up to that point, I didn't really have too much nice to say about the Hellraiser franchise, save for maybe 2 or 3 of those movies. And so when I looked at the trailers and some of the promotional art, I was like, okay, I mean, the designs look cool. It's a director that definitely showed some promise with his short in the first VHS movie. It's actually the only short in that movie that I enjoyed. But is this going to be another Hellraiser movie? And when I say that, that's not a positive thing. And I was so pleasantly surprised that they finally made a Hellraiser movie that focuses entirely on the Cenobites and Pinhead and the Lament configuration as the main plot of the fucking movie. The impending arrival of Pinhead and the Cenobites, that looming threat as the Lament configuration continues to evolve into different configurations. That is the entire plot drive of the movie. That is the entire struggle that the main characters are fighting against. And it's like, finally, how the fuck did it take so long? It was like Saw X. It's like, how did you bitches take this long to give what the fans have been asking for like fucking 20 years? All of the practical effects in this movie, from the Cenobite designs to the gore, is really well done. Even the digital effects that we have in here are very convincing. There's some really cool effects in like transitions where you have the Cenobites trying to come to the real world, and like stairs will appear out of a black top and the walls will move. And it's just really well done as far as bringing forth that whole classic Hellraiser vibe of demons descending on the real world and just appearing out of thin air, and their world converging into ours. I thought the main plot of the movie, as far as why these people have the Lament configuration and what that actually means and what the overall goal of the person that put all this into play is by the end of it, was very classic Hellraiser, but done very well. There was a bit of missed opportunity with the gore here. You know, it wasn't nearly as brutal or as intense as I would expect a modern Hellraiser film to be. You know, it's not something that kills the movie, but it certainly would have added to it in my mind. And a lot of Hellraiser fans, I'm sure, would agree, because you're Hellraiser fans. That's what you want. There was a few missed opportunities with the characters, not the most likable characters in the world, not miserable, not characters that I hated, but certainly not on the level of somebody like Kirsty Cotton that you really root for. And, you know, it was a good start for a new era of Hellraiser. It's a Hellraiser movie that got me excited for the future of the franchise. And I've never been able to say that, to be honest with you. So I really hope this thing succeeded, and I hope that there are already plans in place eventually to revisit this and give us a sequel. And I hope David Bruckner comes back, because I thought he did a damn good job as a director here. It came close to being my number 1 Hellraiser film. That's how much I liked it. And now we have number 5, the top 5 of this miserable ass list. Number 5 is going to be the original Saw. And I know, what? It's not number 1. No, it ain't my number 1. It's my number 5, damn it. The original Saw is absolutely a movie that has a legacy for a reason. It's a movie that I very much remember the first time that I watched it, and I remember how much I was impressed with all of the very interesting things that it was developing and exploring, and all the really neat ideas. Showed a ton of promise for James Wan as well as Lee Winnell, who eventually just came to be horror juggernauts in their own rights. And even, James Wan going on to very different genres besides horror and continuing to succeed massively. And it was just a student film that turned into what I believe is either one of, if not the most profitable horror franchise of all time. And holy shit, like that's a legacy that you definitely would want on your tombstone. I think that Jigsaw is a really interesting concept and a really interesting character that is set up here. And for the most part, he's just kind of talked about. You're just kind of given exposition dumps about who this guy is, and yet he's fascinating. You have some really interesting traps and gore here. While the franchise certainly expanded on that massively after the first film, there's still a lot of iconic nature to like the reverse bear trap and some of the more simple traps from early beginnings here. I think that having some of those Seven vibes and having detectives trying to figure out where Jigsaw is and who he is and what his plan is, while simultaneously this bathroom trap is going on and there's this ticking time element, it's a movie that has an interesting pace, and you're always interested in what's going on because there's so much going on at one time. However, I do feel like this is a movie that has not aged so well. It's a movie that was impressive when it came out, and as the franchise has expanded and improved on a lot of the ideas and concepts here, when I continuously go back to Saw, I'm a bit less enthralled with it. And one of the main things that holds it back for me is Cary Elway's performance. This guy is like a fucking cartoon in certain scenes here. And, I don't hate the guy. I got nothing against him. He's good in Liar Liar, and I'm sure there's a couple of things I haven't seen him in that he's good in, but I have never seen a movie with Cary Elway's in it where he is not one of my least favorite aspects. I just don't like his style. He's very unsubtle. He's very over the top, and by the last act of this movie, whenever he is trying to express his misery and his fear and his emotions, it's just comical to me. And Lee Winnell, all the respect in the world to that dude as a screenwriter and especially as a director. I fucking love his work as an actor in this first film. Woof. And while I was absolutely one of those people that was shocked when Jigsaw stood up, and that's one of the main things that has created this movie's legacy, that people continue to call it one of the best movies of all time because of them remembering how they felt when that twist happened. The twist leading up to that with Zepp being revealed as a pawn, to me, that was incredibly obvious. So there was things about this movie that just never really was top tier for me. So while I love aspects of it, it's a movie that continues to downgrade a bit as time goes on. Coming in at number 4 is Hostel. And there was about 3 or 4 different versions of this list to where number 4 through number 7 changed up quite a bit. Those movies are all pretty close to me to where they could all be tied to a degree. But I sat and I thought about what movie will I never forget of these 4. And Hostel absolutely is the answer to that. It's a movie that of rewatch value is not very high on this list, just like the other 2. A movie like Hostel, the things that it's trying to explore, they're not things that I want to revisit very much. Have you never seen a Hostel movie? Here's a Hostel film. Here's the plot in 10 seconds. Dudes, we're in fucking Amsterdam, bro. Where's the weed at? Dudes, we're in Slovakia now. I'm gonna fuck like every chick here. So yeah, it's not exactly a narrative structure that I love to revisit all that much. But this movie is so effective at what it is trying to do, to the point where this is the only horror movie that I ever saw in the theater that really fucked me up. I will never forget the first time I saw this in theaters, walking in pretty much blind and walking out just numb, just feeling like nothing. Like, oh my God, I just watched real people die. That wasn't a movie. That was a snuff film. And the movies had staying power in my mind because of that. If you watch it nowadays, it probably seems tame. When you watched it back in 2005, it was like, holy fuck, this is the most extreme thing I've ever seen in my life. And so I find the movie to be incredibly valuable for how effective it is at exploring its chosen form of horror. Exploring how it's trying to make you feel uncomfortable. Exploring where it is trying to make your fears come to its worst fruition. And as somebody that very much gets uncomfortable sometimes when I'm a fish out of water and I'm not in situations I can control and I'm not in my element, this is like the worst possible version of that. And it's terrifying to me. The thought of coming across a situation like this, coming across a group of people like this, and not knowing where the hell to turn when you realize that you're in deep shit. Like if I was Paxton's character, I would not know where the fuck to go. I would not know who to talk to, who to trust, who to go to. And to me, that is really intense. And this movie definitely was effective for me at exploring all of that, to where even coming on 20 years after I saw this for the first time, when I revisit it, I re-experienced some of those emotions I had when I first saw it. And I'm like, yep, I remember this thing fucking me up. And I know why. Now, it's got its faults. It's not got very interesting characters. They're not very likable. And it's to the point where I think they want you to dislike these characters to where you think you're actually going to be comfortable watching what's going to happen to them. And then when it starts to happen, you immediately realize that you were wrong and you really don't like watching this. There's some incredibly contrived things in the third act regarding Paxton's escape and his various methods of revenge that just seem to be perfectly lined up. And there's things about it to where I totally get it. It's not everybody's cup of tea. It's not even completely my cup of tea. But of all of the movies that we're talking about today, this list of 31, this is the one that had the most emotional impact for me. It's the one that got the most response out of me. It's the one that I can verbalize my experience with all the way so vividly to today, nearly 20 years later, as if I just watched it this afternoon. And there's just something about that has staying power and that has value for me. So of this list, it's up this high, mostly because of my initial viewing experience and the lasting impression that has had on me. Coming in at number 3 is going to be Saw 2, a movie that was my favorite of this franchise for a very long time. To me, this took everything that was really good about the first film and made it great. You have the very expansive trap and game in this abandoned house and the multiple people that are there for various reasons and all of the individual games and traps that are riddled throughout the house. That is just a really cool expansion. It has some of the most iconic and memorable spots, just like the first film with like the Venus flytrap mask for me. It's very memorable. I love the whole game going on against Detective Matthews, where Jigsaw tells him, you're going to sit here, you're going to watch your son go through this game with all these very dangerous, unpredictable people, and as long as you don't move and you sit right here the entire time that he's going through this, you'll have him safely back in your arms. And the way that the third act of the movie pulls multiple twists off regarding the time displacement, as well as how what Jigsaw said was 100% true and his son was just feet away from him the entire time, as well as the secondary twist of Amanda being an apprentice, and that ultimate reveal was really well done as well. And I just really enjoy this movie as a Saw experience. I think the things that you go to a Saw movie for, this is damn near a perfect version of that. There's not really a whole lot that I could say negative against it. I mean, the best Saw movie to me is still like not a classic by any means. There's just things about it that they're just not my type of movie that I go back and I revisit constantly. But when I come to this subgenre for what it delivers, when I'm in the mood for that Saw experience and what the best versions of a Saw experience can bring you, Saw 2 is absolutely one of the ones that I pick up the most. And by the end of it, I usually enjoy Saw 2 so much that I want to keep watching and pick some other Saw movies. And now we have the top 2. And I will be honest with you, I debated heavily back and forth, which order I was going to put these two in. You have one movie that's brand new that I had a ton of excitement coming out of the theater, so much surprise and shock at how much I enjoyed it. And it's just kind of rejuvenated my fandom for the franchise. And then you have a movie that has an incredible legacy, a lot of horror classic appeal to it, and is in every aspect of the word an iconic staple of the horror genre. And if I could give him a tie and cop out, I would do that. But I would never do that because that's just not how I do things. So number 2 for me is going to be Hellraiser. And I know you're putting a brand new film at number 1. What the fuck? You never do that. You're right. I never do that. But that's just how it's going to be this time. That's my honest thoughts today when I'm recording this. Number 2, Hellraiser. This is the best of the Hellraiser franchise. It's a really interesting concept here with the characters of Frank and Julia and the explorations of pain and pleasure and sexual desire and how they're all one when you take them to their fullest levels. And There's so much about human emotion that is explored here in the most sick and depraved way that it's genuinely a really fucked up concept.
We'll tear your soul apart.
But if we're being honest, I mean, that's the genesis for some of the best aspects of horror, is a really fucked up concept and idea from a really fucked up person who just happens to be incredibly talented, like Clive Barker. Some gnarly gore and gnarly effects here, like the regeneration of Frank has aged really well. His like skin muscle suit where he's covered in red flesh is something that still looks gnarly to this day. The designs of the Cenobites. This is also the only time where putting the Cenobites in the background as kind of the secondary threat actually worked and made sense. Every movie that tried it after this fell on its face with that, but this one at least makes sense because Frank and Julia are your significantly more prevalent villains, and they are the stars of the story that is being told here. Kirsty Cotton, good character, never been one of my favorite final girls. I think she gets to be more interesting as the sequels develop, the 2.25 movies that we actually get with her. But you really like her journey by the end of it when you get to the third act and she has to outwit the Cenobites to then in turn outwit Frank and Julia and survive this horrific scenario where she's facing her father, who is very much not her father. And it's just a wicked flick. I mean, it's a reason why, as bad as the franchise is and as horrible as the legacy of the franchise is, this continues to be a favorite for quite a few horror fans. Now, it's not one of my favorites of all time. You could very easily make a modern Hellraiser film that I prefer to this one. They almost did it last year. A few little tweaks, it would have been my number one. But as my number one Hellraiser film, and as something that is very unique in the things that it's expressing and the things that you will experience when you watch it, it was absolutely up at the top tier of this list in particular. But it's my number two. And my number one is Saw X. And I feel like this is a broken record for me over the past month or so since I saw this at Fantastic Fest. But if you had told me months ago, if you told me a year ago when I first thought of this concept and wanted to do this list specifically because of the release of Saw X, that not only was Saw X going to be my favorite Saw film, but it was going to be my number one on this list, I would have told you you're fucking nuts. There's no way in hell. There's no possibility that can happen. But I'll be damned. I liked this movie, and I liked it a lot. Just like with the Hellraiser remake, when you have the writers and the producers of the Saw franchise finally give you a Saw movie where John Kramer in Jigsaw is the central character and the whole movie revolves around him, you're like, wow, shocking. Who would have thought that was a good idea, except for fucking millions of us? And I'll be honest, before I saw the film, I actually started to lose a little bit of belief in how much of a difference that was actually going to make. But I'll be damned if it did not make a major difference in how much I enjoyed this movie and how much I enjoyed the character of John Kramer, and even knowing he's a fucking psycho that's whacked out of his mind, that has this shitty god complex that's totally unjustified, and so many things that we know about this guy and how sick and depraved he is. This movie still made me look at him as this poor, helpless old man that I want to see triumph over all these other assholes. And that is just such a cool thing that they were able to pull off. The traps were all pretty good. You know, some of them were better than others, but there was one or two of them in particular that were pretty fucking gnarly. I think that the exploration of John and Amanda's relationship had a lot of value to it and set up a lot of interesting places to go in the future. The characters that we are seeing endure all of these traps, you actually want them to endure them. And the main head of the villain, Cecilia, I think that there is a good enough job exploring her as a villain and as a very good foil to John that they very effectively set up what's probably going to be a multi-movie arc of John versus her. I don't think the ending of the movie is the most satisfying. When you know what's going to come in the future, you can kind of stomach it for a bit, and I'm sure it's going to be better once we have whatever amount of follow-ups we get with this, assuming that they're as good as this one, God willing. But for what I want out of a Saw movie, this delivered all that in spades, and then went the extra mile of actually telling a compelling story with a compelling main character that I have been wanting to see explored more since the first film, and have had to wait this long to actually get that. So maybe over time, this will dip in the list. Certainly, if they follow this up and fumble the ball a bit, this will probably dip in my list. But as of right now, I enjoyed Saw X so much, and I have enjoyed continuing to talk about it. I was so excited to tell all the Saw fans that had not seen it yet how awesome I thought it was. And I've done so many different Saw videos, just kind of riding the high of being a Saw fan yet again. that right now it is my number one favorite movie of this year's 31 on 31. Well, that's it for this one, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you on the next one. Until then, you can check out this playlist of all of the previous iterations of 31 on 31, and I'm also going to put my ranking of all of the Saw traps up here for you to check out. Please like, share, hit that subscribe button over here, and be sure to check in the video description below for the links to all of the other companion videos from my friends' channels. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.